There is a specific kind of establishment that exists in the working-class neighborhoods of Southern California that does not announce itself and does not need to. It is not the kind of place that appears in guidebooks or gets reviewed in the weekend supplements of city newspapers or attracts the attention of the food media that was beginning to develop in the late 1970s into something that would eventually become its own industry. It is the kind of place that exists because a specific community in a specific neighborhood needs a specific kind of room. A room that serves reliable food at honest prices in an atmosphere that does not require anyone to perform a version of themselves that the neighborhood has not asked them to perform. The people who eat there because it is theirs in the specific sense that places become theirs when the place has been present in the community long enough to have absorbed the community into its walls and its tables and its particular quality of light and noise, and the specific smell of food that has been prepared the same way in the same kitchen by the same people across enough years that the smell itself has become a form of recognition. Schnortz. Chuck Norris had been involved with the establishment on Hawthorne Boulevard in Lawndale since 1976, when he had provided the initial backing for his friend and former student Ray Medina to open the place after Medina had spent 4 years working in restaurant kitchens and had developed both the technical knowledge and the specific vision of what a neighborhood restaurant should be that he believed justified the risk of opening one. The arrangement between Chuck and Medina was the arrangement of two men who trusted each other in the specific way that trust develops between a teacher and a student, who has become something more than a student, which is a trust built not on paperwork, but on the accumulated evidence of years of honest engagement, in a context that tested the engagement regularly and produced through the testing the specific quality of knowledge about another person that no other process produces with equivalent reliability. Chuck had put money into the place. He had not put his name on it. The name above the door was Medina's name, and the restaurant was Medina's restaurant, in every sense that mattered operationally and publicly. And Chuck's involvement was the involvement of a man who had made a decision he believed in, and who trusted the person he had made it with, to honor the belief, and who therefore had no need to be present in the daily management of the decision, to feel confident that the decision was being honored. He came in occasionally. He ate there when he was in the area. He sat at the corner table near the back window that Medina kept available for him with the straightforward generosity of a man who understood what the backing had made possible and who expressed the understanding in the practical language of a reserved table and a meal that arrived without being ordered, because Medina knew what Chuck ate and had it ready when he came through the door. The staff knew who he was, the regulars knew who he was, the neighborhood knew who he was, in the way that neighborhoods know things, which is completely and without any particular formality around the knowing. The Saturday evening in question was in the late spring of 1979. Chuck was 39 years old. The film career was building steadily toward the commercial peak it would reach in the following years. He had come to Medina's that evening for the specific reason that he came most evenings when he came, which was because the food was honest, and the room was comfortable, and the corner table near the back window was the kind of place where a man could sit without being required to be anything other than what he was. He had been there for approximately 40 minutes, had finished the meal and was drinking coffee and reading a folded newspaper section in the specific way that he read newspapers, which was with the complete attention of a man who had decided that the thing in front of him deserved complete attention and who did not distribute his attention across multiple things simultaneously because the distribution reduced the quality of the attention to a level that did not satisfy his standard for how things deserved to be engaged with. Clear's throat. The restaurant was running at approximately 2/3 capacity that evening. 14 tables occupied. A Saturday crowd that had the specific character of Medina's Saturday crowds, which was the character of a neighborhood in the middle of its weekend, families and couples and a few groups of men who had come together after working weeks that had required things of them that the weekend was now not requiring, and who were therefore in the particular state of ease that the suspension of those requirements produces in men who take the requirements seriously. The kitchen was audible from the dining room in the way that honest restaurant kitchens are audible, not obtrusively, but as a background confirmation that the food is being made by people who are working at a pace that the number of occupied tables requires. Ray Medina was moving between the kitchen and the dining room with the organized efficiency of a man who has been running his own place long enough that the running of it has become an extension of his body rather than a set of tasks he is performing. The two servers on the floor that evening were a woman named Patricia, who had been with Medina since the second month of operation, and a young man named Luis, who had started 3 months ago and who had developed across those 3 months the specific competence of a person who is good at the work and knows it and is still in the period of the knowing where the knowledge is expressed through effort, rather than through the ease that the effort eventually produces when enough time has passed. The door opened at 8:47. The 5 men who came through it the way that 5 men come through a door, when the 5 of them together have decided on a specific quality of entrance, which is the quality that announces the entrance as an event rather than simply a transition from outside to inside. They were bikers in the specific sense of the word that the late 1970s California motorcycle culture produced, which meant that the bikes themselves were the organizational center of an identity that expressed itself through everything attached to the bikes. The leather and the patches, and the specific quality of physical presence that men develop when they have organized their lives around an activity that requires genuine physical courage and that selects for the specific combination of toughness and disregard for the opinions of people outside the activity that the activity rewards. Snorts. They were not small men. The smallest of the 5 was perhaps 5'10" and 190 pounds, and the largest was 6'2" and somewhere in the vicinity of 260 pounds. And all 5 of them moved with the specific quality of men who had been in enough situations that required physical engagement to have stopped performing readiness and to have arrived at the actual thing, which is a different and more concerning quality than the performance, because the performance is for the room, and the actual thing is for whoever the room contains. They had been drinking before they came in, not to the point of impairment in the functional sense, but to the point that the restraints that sober judgment maintains on the expression of the specific energy they were carrying had been loosened to a width that made the expression available at a lower threshold than it would have been available at 2 hours earlier. The leader of the group, a man with a red beard and a cut that identified him as the chapter president of a club whose name Patricia recognized from a previous incident at a bar 2 blocks down the street, looked at the dining room with the specific assessment of a man who is determining the room's configuration relative to his intentions, which were intentions that the room had not yet been informed of, but that the quality of the entrance had already communicated to everyone in it with sufficient clarity that the 14 occupied tables had gone from 2/3 of a Saturday evening to something else entirely in the 12 seconds since the door had opened. Medina came out of the kitchen. He had heard the entrance from behind the pass-through, and had developed across 3 years of running the restaurant on Hawthorne Boulevard the specific sensitivity to the quality of entrances that restaurant owners develop when the restaurant is in a neighborhood where the quality of entrances can vary across a range that requires sensitivity to the variation. He came out with the organized calm of a man who has decided what his approach is going to be before he has finished walking through the kitchen door, and who is executing the approach before the room has fully registered that he is executing it. He said, "Good evening." He said it in the tone of a man who is genuinely willing for the evening to be good, and who is also genuinely clear that the goodness of the evening is something he intends to have a say in. He asked if they wanted a table. The man with the red beard looked at him. He said something that was not an answer to the question about the table. He said it in the tone of a man who has decided that the question about the table is not the relevant question, and that the relevant question is the one he is about to introduce. He said that he had heard there was someone eating in this restaurant tonight who had something to do with the restaurant, and that he and his associates had a specific interest in meeting that person, and that the meeting was going to happen one way or another, and that the only variable was what condition the restaurant was in when the meeting was over. Clear's throat. The 14 occupied tables were very still. The specific stillness of people who have correctly identified that the situation has variables they cannot control, and who have therefore reduced their own variability to the minimum available level, which is the stillness of people who are not moving, and are not speaking, and are directing their attention with complete focus at the situation, without directing any attention at the situation in a way that makes them part of it. Patricia had moved to the far end of the dining room. Louis was near the service station with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man who is 22 years old and is in a situation that his 22 years have not prepared him for, and who is handling it with the specific dignity of a young man who is frightened and knows it, and is not going to allow the being frightened to make the situation worse. Medina looked at the man with the red beard. He said that he was going to need to ask them to leave. He said it in the same organized calm. The man with the red beard said something that constituted a definitive response to the request to leave, which was that the request was not going to be honored, and that the reasons it was not going to be honored were reasons that Medina was going to understand better in the next few minutes than he currently understood them. He moved toward the dining room. 2 of the men behind him moved with him. The other two spread to either side with the practiced spatial awareness of men who understood that 5 people in a room were most effective when they were not all occupying the same section of it. Chuck folded the newspaper. Snorts. He folded it along the original crease with the same unhurried precision that he folded everything, and he placed it on the table to the left of the coffee cup in the position it had been in before he picked it up. He stood up from the corner table near the back window. He stood up in the specific way that he stood up from chairs in situations that required him to stand up from chairs, which was without any of the preparatory movements that telegraph intention, and without the acceleration that urgency adds to movement when urgency is in charge of the movement rather than the person making it. He was wearing dark jeans and a plain gray shirt, and the boots he wore most evenings, and he looked the way he always looked in rooms, which was completely unremarkable in every particular except the specific quality of his presence, which was the quality that rooms full of people who understood physical capability recognized, and that rooms full of people who did not understand physical capability sometimes missed until the understanding arrived. He walked from the corner table toward the center of the dining room with the same pace he used for everything. Clear's throat. The man with the red beard saw him coming and did the assessment that the man with the red beard did with every room he entered, which was the rapid physical evaluation of the relevant variables, and completed the assessment with the conclusion that the man walking toward him from the corner table near the back window was not a variable that the assessment needed to weight heavily. The conclusion was reached on the basis of the available information, which was that the man was approximately 5'10" and 170 pounds, and was wearing jeans and a gray shirt, and was not large, and was not demonstrably armed, and was therefore not the category of problem that the man with the red beard's experience had taught him to weight heavily in his assessments. The experience that produced this conclusion was genuine experience. The conclusion itself was the specific miscalculation that genuine experience produces when the experience has been accumulated exclusively in environments that do not contain the variable it is being asked to evaluate. Snorts. Chuck stopped 8 feet from the man with the red beard. He said one thing. He said it in the calm, even tone that the people who knew him well had learned to recognize as the tone of a man who has assessed a situation and has arrived at a conclusion about what the situation requires and is now communicating the conclusion to the relevant parties before the conclusion becomes operational. He said that the 5 of them were going to leave the restaurant now. He said it in the specific way that certain men say certain things, which is as a statement of what is going to happen, rather than as a request for compliance or a threat about consequences. The man with the red beard looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has just received a communication from a source that his assessment had not weighted heavily and who is in the process of revising the weighting. The revision was not fast enough. Clear's throat, the man with the red beard moved first. He moved with the directness of a man who had resolved the revision process in favor of the original assessment, and who was now implementing the original assessment's conclusion, which was that the man in the gray shirt was not a variable that required any particular adjustment to the plan. He came forward with his right hand rising from his side in the specific motion of a man who has decided that the appropriate response to the communication he has just received is the physical response that his experience has taught him is effective in situations of this kind. The hand did not complete its travel. Chuck's left hand intercepted the wrist of the rising right hand at a point in its arc that the wrist lock that followed the interception required it to be intercepted at, which was before the hand had sufficient momentum behind it to resist the redirection that the wrist lock applied to it. The wrist lock was applied with the specific economy of a technique that has been drilled 10,000 times and that the drilling has reduced from a conscious technical process to the automatic output of a nervous system that has been given the input and produces the output without the deliberation that less practiced execution requires. Snorts. The man with the red beard went forward and down in the specific motion that a wrist lock produces in a man when the lock is applied correctly, and the man's own forward momentum is being used to amplify the lock's effect, rather than simply to resist it. He went to the floor of Medina's restaurant with the sound of a large man making contact with a linoleum floor at a speed that the man had not planned for, and that the floor was completely indifferent to. The second man was already moving. He had been moving since the moment his chapter president moved, which was the specific synchronized response of men who have been in enough situations together to have developed an operational understanding that when one of them initiates, the others initiate simultaneously rather than sequentially. He came from the left with the committed drive of a man who was intending to close the distance and establish the physical engagement at the range where his size was most effective. Chuck pivoted on his right foot. The pivot was the same 45-degree rotation that removed his center line from the path of a committed forward drive without requiring him to move his feet significantly or create any of the large visible defensive movements that communicate the defense before it is complete. The second man's drive continued past the space Chuck had been occupying. In the continuation of the pivot, Chuck's right elbow came back and around and made contact with the second man's jaw at the specific angle and with the specific force that the elbow generates when a man with 30 years of Tang Soo Do training drives it through the arc that the pivot has prepared it for. Clears throat. The second man's head snapped to the right with the contact, and he continued forward and down in the way that a man continues forward and down when his forward momentum encounters a force that redirects rather than stops it. He was on the floor before the first man had finished processing the fact that he was on the floor. The third and fourth men came together. They came from slightly different angles, the third from the right and the fourth from slightly behind the third, and they came with the understanding that the sequential approach had not worked and that simultaneous engagement from multiple angles was the adjustment the situation required. Snorts. Chuck read the angles. He had been reading angles since the early 1960s in tournament contexts that required him to read them accurately and quickly enough that the reading preceded the attack rather than responding to it. He stepped toward the third man rather than away from him, which was the movement that the third man's approach was not organized around because the third man's approach was organized around the assumption that the target would move away or would receive the approach without the lateral movement that stepping toward the attacker from a slightly offset angle produces. The step toward produced the offset angle. The offset angle produced a front kick to the third man's midsection that was thrown at the range that the step had created, which was the range at which Chuck's techniques were most effective and at which the third man's approach had the least available response because the approach was committed and the commitment could not be reversed at the range the step had closed to. The kick landed flush. The sound it made on the third man's midsection was the sound of a kick landing on a committed body, which is a specific and comprehensive sound that communicates more information than most sounds communicate and communicates it immediately and without ambiguity. The third man folded forward with the kick's impact, and Chuck's right hand came up and around in a short controlled arc that met the third man's descending jaw with the palm strike that the folding forward had made available. The third man went to the floor. Clears throat. The fourth man had been one step behind the third. The one step had been enough for him to see what the step toward and the front kick and the palm strike had produced in the third man, and to process the production in the specific rapid way that men process information when the information is about something happening to someone who is standing one step in front of them. He stopped. He stopped in the specific way that men stop when their forward movement has been interrupted by the arrival of information that the movement did not account for, and that the movement cannot continue past without the information being addressed. He looked at Chuck. He looked at the three men on the floor. He looked at Chuck again. Snorts. The fifth man had not moved from the position he had taken near the door when the five of them had spread across the dining room in the first minutes of the entrance. He had been in that position for the entirety of what had just occurred, and he had watched it from that position with the specific quality of attention that proximity to a fast physical event produces in the people who are close enough to it to see everything and far enough from it to be processing the seeing rather than being inside what is being seen. He was looking at Chuck from near the door with an expression that contained several things simultaneously, which were the things that a man's expression contains when he has just watched four of the men he came in with reach the floor in a duration that his mind is still attempting to reconcile with his prior understanding of how long things take. Clears throat, Chuck looked at the fourth man. He said the same thing he had said when he walked from the corner table to the center of the dining room, which was that they were going to leave now. He said it in the same tone, not louder. Not with any additional emphasis produced by what had occurred in the interval between the first saying and the second. The same calm, even statement of what was going to happen. The fourth man looked at the floor. He looked at the three men on it. He looked at the fifth man near the door. He said something to the fifth man that the people at the nearest tables heard, but that none of them later chose to repeat in any account of the evening. Partly because the hearing of it had been peripheral and the words had not been entirely clear, and partly because the repetition of it was not necessary for the account to be complete. The fifth man opened the door. He held it open. Snorts. The man with the red beard got up from the floor of Medina's restaurant. He got up with the specific physical care of a man whose body has recently made unplanned contact with a hard surface and whose nervous system is still completing its assessment of the consequences of that contact. He stood. He looked at Chuck. Chuck looked at him with the open, settled expression that he had been wearing since before he stood up from the corner table, which was the same expression he wore in every context that required him to pay attention to something, which was the expression of a man who was seeing what was in front of him without any of the emotional interference that most people cannot prevent from entering the space between perception and response. The man with the red beard held the looking for approximately 3 seconds. Then he moved toward the door. The second man got up. He moved toward the door. The third man got up more slowly than the first two and moved toward the door. The fourth man was already at the door. Clear's throat. The 5 of them went through the door in the specific quality of exit that is the precise inverse of the quality of entrance they had arrived with, which is the quality of men who are leaving a room rather than entering it, and who are leaving it in the specific condition of men whose operational assumptions about the room have been comprehensively revised, in a duration shorter than any of them had estimated the revision would take if the revision were going to occur at all. The door closed behind the 5th man. The sound of 5 motorcycles starting in the parking lot of Medina's restaurant came through the walls with the specific quality of sound that motorcycle engines make when the men riding them have somewhere else to be and are proceeding toward that, somewhere else with the urgency of men who have revised their assessment of the room they just left. The sound moved away from the restaurant and diminished in the way that engine sounds diminish with distance, and was eventually replaced by the ambient sound of Hawthorne Boulevard on a Saturday evening, which was the sound of a commercial street doing what commercial streets do on Saturday evenings, and which was completely indifferent to the specific events that had just occurred in the restaurant on its block. Ray Medina stood in the center of the dining room. He had been standing in approximately the same position since Chuck had walked from the corner table and had remained in that position across the entirety of what had followed, with the specific quality of stillness that a man maintains when he is watching something that he does not want to interrupt, and that he trusts the person he is watching to complete without requiring his intervention. He looked at Chuck. Chuck looked at the dining room. The 14 occupied tables were still occupied. The specific stillness that had settled over them when the door opened had not entirely lifted, but had been replaced by something different, which was the stillness of people who are in the process of moving from the state the previous few minutes had required of them back to the state the previous hour had been producing before the door opened. Patricia was at the far end of the room. Luis was at the service station with his hands still at his sides but with a different quality of stillness than the previous quality, the quality of a man who has just watched something that is going to require some internal processing before he is ready to resume the tasks the evening requires of him. Snorts. Chuck walked back to the corner table. He sat down, he picked up the coffee cup and looked at it, and set it back down because the coffee had gone cold in the time since he had folded the newspaper and stood up. He looked at Medina. He said that he was going to need a fresh cup. He said it in the tone of a man making a practical request about coffee rather than a statement about anything else. Medina looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has just watched his restaurant and his livelihood, and the 3 years of daily work that the restaurant and the livelihood represented be protected by the person who had backed him when backing him, was the act of someone who believed in what he was trying to build and who is now asking for a fresh cup of coffee in the tone of a man who has done nothing more remarkable than notice that his coffee has gone cold. Medina said that he would get it. He walked to the kitchen. He came back with a fresh cup. He set it on the table next to where the folded newspaper was. Chuck picked it up. He drank. He picked up the newspaper. He found the page he had been on. He continued reading. Clear's throat, Patricia told her husband that night, and her mother the following week, and the story moved from there in the specific way that stories move when they originate in small communities and concern something that the community needs to process collectively before it can be filed under the category of things that have been understood. The regulars at Medina's told it to people who were not regulars. The people who were not regulars came in to eat and confirmed the telling with Medina, who confirmed the essential facts without elaborating on them in the way of a man who knows that the essential facts are sufficient and that elaboration would be a form of taking credit for something that was not his to take credit for. Luis told it to every person he knew who was his age, and the telling acquired across those retellings the specific quality of urgency that stories acquire when the person telling them is young enough that the event they are describing is the most remarkable thing they have yet witnessed in a life that has not yet produced enough remarkable things to provide context for the remarkableness. The man with the red beard was not seen on Hawthorne Boulevard again. The other 4 were not seen on Hawthorne Boulevard again. The other 4 were not seen on Hawthorne Boulevard again. The restaurant continued. Medina kept the corner table near the back window available. Chuck came in when he was in the area. He ate the food that arrived without being ordered because Medina knew what he ate, and had it ready when he came through the door. He sat and read the newspaper in the specific way that he read newspapers, which was with complete attention and without dividing that attention across anything else in the room, because the room did not require his attention and the newspaper did, and the distinction between what required his attention and what did not was a distinction that 39 years of honest engagement with the world had made very clear to him and that he had no reason to blur. Snorts. There is a quality that the practice of genuine physical capability produces in the men who have developed it honestly across enough years and enough genuine pressure, and it is not the quality that the cultural mythology of physical capability tends to celebrate, which is the invincibility, the dominance, the specific performance of dangerousness that certain kinds of men produce for rooms that they want to impress. The quality that genuine capability produces is something quieter and more durable and more useful than any of those things. It is the quality of a man who knows what he is capable of, with sufficient completeness that the knowledge has become structural rather than situational, who does not need to perform the capability because the capability does not require performance to exist, and who can therefore sit in a corner table near a back window and read a newspaper and drink coffee, and be entirely present for the newspaper and the coffee rather than for the room. Because the room does not require him to manage it, and he knows with the specific and irreducible certainty of a man who has found out what is true about himself under genuine pressure that the room will only require him to manage it if the room presents him with something that genuinely requires managing. The room on Hawthorne Boulevard on a Saturday evening in the late spring of 1979 presented him with something that genuinely required managing. He managed it. He went back to the newspaper. He asked for a fresh cup of coffee. The coffee was better than the cold cup had been. The newspaper continued where it had left off. The evening continued. That was the quality. That was the whole of it.